The quiet hum of the hospital lobby was interrupted by the sharp, rhythmic kick of running footsteps. Nurses glanced up from their stations, startled as a young boy, no older than 10, burst through the double doors. He was drenched in sweat, his small chest heaving as he clutched a pale, motionless infant tightly in his arms. The sight was jarring. His dark, tear-streaked face filled with desperation, contrasted against the fragile, ghostly white baby bundled in a blanket. "Help! Somebody please!" His voice cracked, echoing through the sterile halls. A few patients in the waiting area turned their heads, murmuring in confusion. Nurses exchanged quick glances before springing into action. The boy stumbled toward the front desk, his legs trembling under the weight of fear and urgency. "She's not breathing," he cried, his voice trembling. "You have to save her." The head nurse, a woman named Mrs. Carter, immediately stepped forward. She crouched down, her tone calm yet firm. "What's her name, sweetheart? What happened?" "I don't know her name," he stammered, clutching the baby even tighter. "But she's gonna die if you don't help." Mrs. Carter's expression shifted, her professional mask slipping for a brief second as confusion flickered across her face. A boy this young, carrying a baby who clearly wasn't his sibling. What was going on? But there wasn't time for questions. She motioned for another nurse to grab a stretcher. "Okay, honey, we're going to help her. Just come with me," she said, her voice as soothing as she could make it. But before they could move, Dr. Howard, the on-call physician, emerged from a nearby room. He was a middle-aged man with a sharp mind and an even sharper sense of responsibility. His eyes narrowed as he took in the scene. A terrified black boy, a lifeless white infant, and a growing sense of panic in the air. "What's going on here?" he demanded, striding over. The boy's voice rose, a mix of urgency and helplessness. "She's not breathing. You have to do something." Dr. Howard quickly examined the baby, his practiced hands checking for signs of life. It took only a moment for his expression to harden. "We need to get her to the ER now," he ordered. "And someone call security." "Security?" Mrs. Carter asked, startled. "Yes." Dr. Howard's voice was firm, his eyes never leaving the boy. "Lock down the building." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. Nurses froze, and a murmur rippled through the waiting area. The boy's eyes widened in fear. "Bellevue, why?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Dr. Howard didn't answer, his focus solely on the baby as he and the nurses rushed her toward the emergency room. Behind them, the boy stood frozen, his small hands trembling. He didn't understand what was happening, but he knew one thing: he couldn't let her die. As the doors to the ER swung shut, sealing the baby inside, the boy looked around, his heart pounding. People were staring at him, whispering things he couldn't hear but could feel. Suspicion, judgment, fear. And then, from somewhere behind him, a deep voice broke through the chaos. "Boy, you better start talking. Who are you, and where did you get that baby?" The boy turned slowly, his stomach twisting into knots. He didn't know how to explain. He wasn't even sure they would believe him if he did. But the truth couldn't wait much longer. The boy froze, his heart racing as he turned to face the man who had spoken. It was a security guard, tall and broad, with a stern expression that made the boy feel even smaller than he already did. The murmurs in the waiting room grew louder, a swirl of voices that felt like they were closing in on him. He tightened his grip on the now empty blanket, as if it could shield him from the weight of everyone's stares. I didn't do anything wrong," the boy stammered, his voice barely audible. "I was just trying to help her." The security guard stepped closer, lowering his voice but not his intensity. "Help her how? Where did you find that baby?" His eyes searched the boy's face, looking for answers the boy wasn't sure how to give. The boy took a shaky step back, his gaze darting toward the ER doors where the baby had disappeared. I found her outside," he said finally, his words tumbling out. "She was in the alley in a box. She wasn't moving, and I didn't know what else to do. So I brought her here." The security guard's eyes narrowed, but before he could say anything else, Mrs. Carter stepped in. Her tone was firm but kind, a contrast to the mounting tension in the room. "Let's give him a chance to explain," she said, placing a gentle hand on the boy's shoulder. "He's just a child." The boy felt a flicker of relief at her words, but it was short-lived. He could still feel the weight of the security guard's gaze, the curiosity and suspicion of everyone around him. "Start from the beginning," Mrs. Carter urged softly. "Tell us exactly what happened." The boy swallowed hard, his throat dry. He wished he had the words to make them understand, but the truth sounded strange even to him. He took a deep breath and began. "I was walking home," he said, his voice trembling. "I cut through the alley like I always do. And then I heard the sound. It was really faint, like a whimper or something. I almost ignored it, but it didn't stop. So I went to check." He paused, his hands gripping the blanket so tightly that his knuckles turned white. There was this box, just sitting there by the dumpster. It was so small. And when I looked inside, she was there, the baby. Mrs. Carter nodded gently, encouraging him to continue. The security guard crossed his arms, his expression unreadable. "She wasn't crying or anything," the boy went on. "She was so still, and I thought she was already gone. But then she moved, just a little, and I knew I had to do something. I couldn't just leave her there." The room was silent except for the faint buzz of fluorescent lights. The boy glanced at Mrs. Carter, desperate for some sign that she believed him. "What time was this?" the security guard asked, his voice gruff. The boy hesitated. "I don't know, maybe an hour ago." The guard frowned, his eyes narrowing. "And you didn't see anyone else? No one around who might have left her there?" The boy shook his head quickly. "No, it was just me. I looked around, but the alley was empty." Mrs. Carter's hand tightened slightly on the boy's shoulder. "You did the right thing bringing her here," she said gently. "We'll do everything we can to help her." The boy nodded, but her words didn't ease the knot in his stomach. He could still feel the suspicion in the air, the unspoken questions hanging over him. Why was he in that alley? Why was a black boy carrying a white baby into a hospital in the middle of the night? As if reading his thoughts, the security guard leaned in slightly. "What's your name, kid?" "Marcus," the boy said quietly. "Marcus what?" "Marcus Reed." The guard nodded slowly, filing the name away. "You live around here?" Marcus nodded again. "A few blocks away." Before the guard could press further, a loud buzz echoed through the lobby, followed by the sharp click of the intercom. "Code Gray. All personnel code Gray." The announcement sent a ripple of unease through the room. Mrs. Carter straightened, her professional demeanor slipping back into place. The security guard pulled out his radio, speaking in low tones as he stepped away. Marcus looked around, his fear rising again. "What's a code Gray?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Mrs. Carter hesitated, her eyes darting toward the ER doors. "It just means we're taking precautions," she said, her tone careful. "Don't worry, it's nothing you need to be scared of." But Marcus wasn't convinced. He could see the tension in her face, the way her hands fidgeted with the hem of her uniform. Something was wrong, something more than he understood. The ER doors burst open, and Dr. Howard emerged, his expression grim. He walked straight to Mrs. Carter, speaking in hurried whispers that Marcus couldn't quite catch. But he caught enough. Words like unresponsive, stabilizing, and authorities floated through the air, each one sinking like a stone in his chest. "What's happening?" Marcus asked, stepping forward. "Is she okay?" Dr. Howard glanced at him briefly, his face unreadable. "We're doing everything we can." The words were meant to reassure, but they didn't. Marcus could feel the distance growing between him and the baby he tried to save. The more questions they asked, the more it felt like they didn't trust him, like they thought he was hiding something. And then, as if to confirm his fears, 2 police officers walked through the front doors. Their uniforms were crisp, their expressions serious as they scanned the room. Marcus's stomach twisted into knots. "Are you Marcus Reed?" one of them asked, their tone calm but firm. Marcus nodded, his voice caught in his throat. "We need to ask you a few questions," the officer said, motioning for him to step aside. Marcus hesitated, his legs feeling like they were rooted to the floor. He looked back at Mrs. Carter, his eyes pleading. "I didn't do anything wrong," he said again, his voice trembling. She gave him a small, reassuring nod. "Go with them, Marcus. Just tell them the truth." But as Marcus followed the officers to a quiet corner of the room, his mind raced. Would the truth be enough? Would they believe him? Or had he just stepped into a situation far bigger than he could handle? And in the back of his mind, one question lingered, heavy and unshakable. Who had left the baby in that alley, and why? Marcus sat on a worn bench in the corner of the waiting room, his legs swinging nervously as the 2 officers stood in front of him. Their faces were calm, but their sharp eyes seemed to notice everything. The way Marcus clutched the blanket, the dirt smear on his sneakers, the faint tremor in his hands. He wanted to explain everything, to make them see that all he had done was try to help. But the weight of their questions made his throat feel tight. "Marcus, we just need to understand what happened," the taller officer said, his voice steady but firm. "Start from the beginning." "I already told them," Marcus said softly, glancing over at Mrs. Carter, who was watching from the nurse's station. Her presence gave him a small sense of comfort, but it didn't stop the knot in his stomach from growing. I found the baby in the alley. She was in a box by the dumpster. I didn't know what else to do, so I brought her here. The shorter officer, a woman with kind eyes but a serious expression, crouched slightly to meet Marcus's gaze. Did you see anyone else there? Maybe someone leaving the box or walking away? Marcus shook his head. No, it was empty, just me and her. The officers exchanged a glance that Marcus couldn't quite read. The woman spoke again, her tone gentle. Marcus, do you know anyone who might have left her there? Someone from your neighborhood or school? No, Marcus said quickly, his voice rising. I don't know anything about her, I swear. The male officer nodded slowly, but his expression remained unreadable. Okay, Marcus, thank you for telling us. We're going to look into this, but we'll need to ask you some more questions later. For now, stay here, all right? Marcus nodded reluctantly, his fingers tightening around the blanket. He watched as the officers walked away, their low voices blending into the hum of the hospital. He felt small and powerless, like no matter how hard he tried to do the right thing, it wasn't enough. Meanwhile, in the ER, the baby was being stabilized. Dr. Howard moved quickly, issuing orders to the nurses as they worked to bring her tiny body back to life. He couldn't stop thinking about how she had ended up in that alley. The questions gnawed at him, distracting him even as he focused on saving her. Who would abandon a baby like this? And why? As Dr. Howard worked, another subplot quietly unfolded. One of the nurses, Grace, had been scrolling through local news on her break when she came across a startling report. A nearby police station had issued an alert earlier that evening. A missing infant, taken from her home just hours ago. The baby's description was eerily similar to the one now lying in their ER. Grace's heart raced as she glanced toward the emergency room. Could it be the same child? She hesitated for only a moment before forwarding the report to Dr. Howard's tablet. He saw the notification pop up and paused to read it, his face darkening as he connected the dots. If this was the missing baby, then Marcus's story was even more complicated than it seemed. Dr. Howard stepped into the hallway and called the officers over. He showed them the alert, his voice low but urgent. I think this might be the baby we're treating, he said. You need to confirm this with the family. The officers' expressions grew more serious as they read the report. If this is the same baby, the male officer said, we need to figure out how she ended up in that alley and how Marcus got involved. Back in the waiting room, Marcus sat quietly, trying to ignore the stares from the other patients. He felt like an exhibit on display, everyone whispering and speculating about him. His mind wandered to the alley, to the moment he had found the baby. He couldn't shake the image of her tiny face, so pale and fragile. Who would leave her like that? And why? Mrs. Carter approached him, her kind eyes softening as she crouched to his level. Marcus, are you okay? She asked gently. He shrugged, not trusting himself to speak. His throat felt tight, and he was afraid that if he opened his mouth he might cry. He hated how everyone was treating him, like he had done something wrong. All he wanted was to save her. You did a brave thing bringing her here, Mrs. Carter said softly. No matter what anyone says, remember that. Her words brought a flicker of warmth to his chest, but it wasn't enough to push away the growing fear. What if they didn't believe him? What if they thought he had something to do with why the baby was in that alley? Before Marcus could respond, the officers returned, their expressions unreadable. The male officer crouched in front of him again, his voice calm but serious. Marcus, we need to ask you a few more questions, he said. This is really important. Marcus nodded slowly, his heart pounding. Okay. We think the baby might be connected to a case we're working on, the officer continued. There's a family nearby whose baby went missing earlier tonight. Do you know anything about that? Marcus' eyes widened in shock. Missing? No, I didn't know that. I just found her in the alley, I swear. The female officer nodded, her tone gentle. We believe you, Marcus, but we have to make sure we understand everything. Did you see anyone near the alley who might have left her there? Maybe someone you didn't recognize. Marcus shook his head quickly, his voice trembling. No, it was just me and her. I didn't see anyone. The officers exchanged another glance, their expressions grim. Thank you, Marcus, the male officer said finally. You've been a big help. But Marcus didn't feel like he helped at all. He felt like he was sinking deeper into a mess he didn't understand, with no way out. In the background, the hospital staff continued their work, the tension in the air palpable. Dr. Howard and Grace exchanged quiet words, their concern growing as more pieces of the puzzle came together. The baby's condition was stabilizing, but the mystery surrounding her was only deepening. And somewhere, in the quiet shadows of the city, someone knew the truth about how the baby had ended up in that alley. Someone who might be watching, waiting, and wondering if their secret would stay hidden, or if it was only a matter of time before everything unraveled. The hospital was unusually quiet as the night stretched on, the kind of silence that weighed heavy, like the calm before a storm. Marcus sat in the same spot, his small frame hunched over as if he could somehow make himself invisible. Every so often he glanced toward the double doors leading to the emergency room, hoping for an update about the baby. But each time they remained closed, leaving him with nothing but his swirling thoughts. The officers had stepped away to make a few calls, their voices low and hurried as they pieced together what little they had. Dr. Howard stood near the nurse's station, his brow furrowed as he reviewed the baby's vitals. She was stable now, but barely. Her tiny body had fought hard against the cold and hunger, and it was clear she had been abandoned for hours before Marcus found her. Despite everything, she had survived, though the question of how long she might last weighed heavily on everyone's mind. Grace returned with a printout of the missing persons alert, her lips pressed into a thin line. "It's definitely her," she whispered to Dr. Howard, her voice trembling slightly. "The details match perfectly. Her name is Lily. She's only 3 months old." Dr. Howard exhaled slowly, his mind racing. "And the parents?" he asked. "They're with the police," Grace replied. "They're devastated. From what I've heard, someone broke into their house tonight. Took Lily right out of her crib." Dr. Howard's jaw tightened. This is more than just abandonment. Someone wanted that baby out of sight. The weight of her words hung in the air, unspoken fears creeping into their thoughts. The pieces of the puzzle didn't fit together neatly. If Marcus had truly found Lily in the alley, then who had put her there? And why? The timeline was thin, the details murky. Every answer only seemed to lead to more questions. In the waiting room, Marcus shifted nervously as the officers returned. Their expressions were grave but not unkind. The female officer crouched down to his level again, her voice quieter than before. "Marcus, we've learned a little more about the baby," she said. "Her name is Lily. She was taken from her home earlier tonight." Marcus' eyes widened, his heart sinking. "Taken? Like kidnapped?" The officer nodded slowly. "Yes, that's why we need your help. You said you found her in the alley, right? Are you sure there wasn't anyone else there? Someone who might have been watching you?" Marcus shook his head vigorously. "No, it was just me. I didn't see anyone, I promise." The officers exchanged another glance, clearly unsettled. The male officer spoke next, his tone still calm but firmer now. "Marcus, it's really important that you're honest with us. We're not saying you did anything wrong, but if there's something you're not telling us, anything at all, it could help us figure out what happened." "I am telling the truth," Marcus cried, his voice cracking. "I swear I don't know anything else. I just found her and brought her here because I couldn't leave her there." Tears welled up in his eyes, and for a moment the officers hesitated. They could see the raw emotion in his face, the fear and confusion of a boy caught in something far bigger than himself. The female officer placed a hand on his shoulder, her grip gentle but reassuring. "We believe you, Marcus," she said softly, "but we have to keep looking for answers. You did the right thing by bringing her here." As the officers stepped away again, Marcus felt a flicker of relief, but it was quickly overshadowed by the weight of everything happening around him. He stared at the floor, his mind racing. He had done the right thing, hadn't he? So why did it feel like everything was spiraling out of control? In the emergency room, Lily's vitals beat steadily on the monitor, a fragile reminder of her fight to survive. Dr. Howard stood by her bedside, his thoughts clouded with questions. Who would take a baby from her home and leave her in such a state? And why had Marcus been the one to find her? Unbeknownst to anyone, a shadowy figure lingered outside the hospital, their movements slow and deliberate. They watched the glowing lights of the ER with a mixture of dread and determination. The plan had gone horribly wrong, and now they were running out of options. The baby was supposed to disappear quietly, no questions asked. But Marcus had disrupted everything, and now the entire city was on edge. Inside, the tension only grew. The officers received an update from their precinct, a potential lead on a car spotted near the alley earlier that evening. It was a faint trail, but it was something. The officers exchanged a glance, silently agreeing that time was of the essence. If the person responsible was still nearby, they needed to act fast. But the lead came with a chilling implication. If the car's driver had left Lily in the alley, it meant they were still in the area, watching. waiting. Marcus, oblivious to the developments around him, clutched the blanket tightly. He thought about his mom, how much she had done for him despite their struggles. He thought about Lily, so small and helpless, and how her life had almost ended before it had truly begun. And he thought about the alley, the eerie stillness that had enveloped him as he cradled her tiny body. He didn't know it yet, but the answers were closer than anyone realized. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to shift, the truth inching closer to the surface. And as the shadow outside the hospital moved closer, the night seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the moment when everything would come to a head. For Marcus, Dr. Howard, and the officers, the stakes had never been higher. And for Lily, every second counted.